In this video, we start dealing with OAuth, all right? And in this project, we'll be using two OAuth providers. We have Google and we have GitHub, okay? The way the project is set up, you can easily integrate other OAuth providers in your project. Possibly you prefer using, let's say, Facebook or LinkedIn or Discord or any other OAuth provider, okay? So the way I set up the project, you can easily integrate all of these OAuth providers into your application, all right? And talking about OAuth authentication, there are three major participants in the whole OAuth process, okay? We have the user, we have your server, and we have the OAuth servers, all right? Sometimes the OAuth servers might be subdivided into two. We have the authorization server and we have the resource server, okay? And sometimes both of them might be combined together into the same server, all right? But this is how the whole thing works together. Before the user is going to be able to authenticate with a certain OAuth provider, that means the user must have registered with that OAuth provider. For example, let's say your user wants to authenticate with Google. So before they can do that, they must have created an account with Google, okay? And the second thing is that before you can authenticate users on your application with a certain OAuth provider, you must have registered your application with that OAuth provider. So those are the two basic requirements of any OAuth authentication process. Your user must have had an account with that provider, and you too, as the developer, you must have registered your application with that OAuth provider, okay? So on successful registration of your application with that provider, the provider is going to give you a client ID and a client secret, okay? This is standard for all of the OAuth providers, okay? If you register your app with Google, they are going to give you client ID and client secret. When you registered with GitHub, they are going to give you client ID and client secret. So it is these credentials that stand as unique identifier of your application whenever any user wants to authenticate on your application, okay? So the user's data that want to access from the OAuth providers, they are stored on the resource server of that provider, okay? For example, in our application now, we need the email address of the user. We also need the name of the user. In this case, we will not be needing a password, okay? So all the authentication and authorization will be done by the provider. So we don't need the password. All we need for our application is just the name and the email address. And all of these details, they are stored on the resource server of the OAuth provider. And before our application can access the resource server, then the user must have authorized our application to be able to access the details on the resource server, okay? So now in the OAuth authentication procedure, the first thing that initializes the whole process is that the user is going to make a request to our own server, telling our server that, oh, Mr. Server, I want to authenticate with Google, or Mr. Server, I want to authenticate with GitHub. Okay, so that's happen whenever the user clicks any of these buttons, okay? All websites or application, they have buttons like this or links where the user is going to initialize this process. So whenever the user clicks on any of these buttons, then they are sending a request to our server, telling our server that I want to authenticate with, let's say, Google, for example, okay? And on receiving that request from the user, our server is going to generate a URL. The URL at the end is going to redirect the user to the authorization server of the OAuth provider, okay? Alongside that redirect request is going to be our client ID, which is the identifier of our application. We're also going to pass along the redirect URI. That redirect URI is where the authorization server is going to redirect our user if the user grants permission to our application, okay? So along the request, we have the client ID, we have the redirect URI. The redirect URI is what we will be using this to create, okay, this OAuth redirect URI based environment variable. So we'll be using this as part of the redirect URI, okay? And alongside that request is also something we call scope. Okay, so the scope we pass along to that request is what that is going to determine the kind of data we can access on the resource server of the OAuth provider. Possibly we need just the name and the email address. So we are going to provide those as the scope that we need to access from the resource server. So all of those, they are going to be passed along with the request that we are passing along to the authorization server of the OAuth provider. Okay. Now, when the authorization server receives that request through redirection, the authorization server is going to ask the user to grant permission to our application. That is the process when you are going to be seeing the Google page, for example, for a user that is using Google. That is when you are going to see that prompt page that is going to ask the user to grant permission to a certain application. Okay, so that happens at this stage. Whenever the authorization server receives that request through redirection, then the authorization server is going to ask the user to grant permission or deny permission to that application. If the user denies the access request, then the whole authorization procedure is going to be terminated at that point. But if the user grants the permission, then the authorization server is going to respond with an authorization code. Okay, so the authorization server is going to redirect the user to our server, and the endpoint that the user will be redirected to is the endpoint that we provided at this point, this redirect URI. Okay, so that is the endpoint that the authorization server is going to redirect our user to, and alongside that response is going to be an authorization code. Okay, so it is that authorization code that we are going to use to confirm on the authorization server if the user actually grants permission to our application. Okay, but on this stage the user is no longer in the loop. Okay, so after getting the authorization code at this point, our server is going to make a secret connection to the authorization server. It's going to be sending a secret request from server to server. So that is going to exclude the user from the loop. So our server now is going to be presenting that authorization code to the authorization server. Okay, so the authorization server is going to get the code from the request and verify if the code is actually valid. All right, so if the code is valid, then the authorization server is going to be responding with an access token and a refresh token. But if the initial authorization code is not valid, then the authorization server is going to be responding with an error. Okay, but if it is valid, it is going to respond with access token and refresh token. What we actually need is the access token, but for security purpose, the access token is short-lived. Okay, so let's say you need the access token. After the access token has expired, you can now use the refresh token to request for another access token on the authorization server. Okay, now after getting the access token and the request token on the response, then we can now use the access token to request for the user data on the resource server. You know, the user data that we needed, for example, the name and the email address, all of those, they are residing on the resource server. Okay, possibly in your own application you might be needing the user profile picture. So all of those, they are residing on the resource server. Okay, so we'll be needing the access token. We'll be using the access token we got at this point. We'll be using the token to request for the user's details. All right, and the details we can access on the resource server, they are, all those details are determined by the scope that we pass along initially when we redirected the user to the authorization server initially. Okay, so the kind of details we can access on the resource server, they are dependent on that scope that we pass along in the first redirect to the authorization server. Okay, so whenever this resource server receives the access token, it is going to verify with the authorization server if the access token is actually valid. If it is valid, then it is going to respond to our server with the user's details. If it is not valid, then it is going to return with an error. Okay, so after getting the user's details from the resource server, then we can now grant access to our user to access whatever protected route that we have on our own application. Okay, So that is how the whole process comes together. The whole thing might look kind of complex, but it is very simple if you actually take a closer look at it. Okay, so initially the user is going to tell our server that I want to authenticate with this provider. Then our server is going to generate a URL that contains our client ID, the scope, the response type that we need, like the authorization code. So all of those, they are going to be on the URL that our server is going to generate. Then our server is going to redirect the user to the authorization server. Okay, so the authorization server is going to ask the user to permit our application. So what happens next is going to determine if the user actually grants the permission to our request, or the user denies the permission. Okay, so if the user grants the permission, then the authorization server is going to redirect the user back to our server, carrying along the authorization code alongside the response. Okay, so our server now is going to make a secret request to the authorization server using that authorization code to verify if the user actually grants permission to our application. So this authorization server is then going to verify if the authorization code is valid. If it is valid, then it is going to respond with an access token and a refresh token. All right, but if the authorization code is not valid, then it is going to return with an error. Okay, so assuming the authorization code is valid, it is going to respond with access token and refresh token. Okay, so with that access token, our own server can now make a request to the resource server that is containing the data that we actually need, the user's data, for example, the name, the email address, the profile picture, and every other details. But the details that we can access, they are dependent on the scope that we initially passed along to the authorization server. Okay, so now the resource server is going to respond with the user's details. So after getting those, we can now grant permission to our user to access whatever protected resources they want to access in our application. So that's how the whole thing comes together. All right, don't forget to give this video a like if you find it helpful, and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be notified when subsequent videos are being released. All right, thanks for subscribing, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.